I got a freelance gig, actually at NBC Radio, which was the only time in my career that a qualification was ever asked for or seemed to have any use. That this American guy who was working at NBC Radio came in and had spent a summer at Cambridge, and so was terribly impressed that I had been to Cambridge, and so said, well, come on, I'll choose you and you to come and freelance for NBC Radio, which just involved clipping tape from the Today programme, BBC, and feeding it back to America. And then increasingly I was talking to people in Russia and commissioning radio reports from BBC people there, because again there was some deal between NBC and BBC. And so I started getting involved in the 89-90 situation in Russia, which was very dramatic. You know, the Berlin Wall was about to fall down and so on. And then at some point I just got it in my head that I was going to become a freelance journalist in Moscow, and I was going to give it a shot. So I persuaded NBC Radio to write a letter saying I was one of their stringers, their freelance reporters. And I turned up in Moscow, and it was very lucky because at that point there were no freelancers really, no foreign freelancers, and I had this letter. I was quickly told by the 3 other freelancers for NBC in Moscow that there was no chance, unless all of them were on holiday, that I would get to report for them. But the Evening Standard, the woman who was doing that, she was like, oh my God, somebody who can fill in for me on holiday. So I started filling in for her. IRN Radio and lots of other freelance gigs started coming together to make a kind of small career, especially since Moscow was so cheap those days.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role of a stringer. What is a stringer, and how is that difficult, or what challenges does that throw up to be a stringer?
Well, the difference between the producer and the stringer is that it's an on-air, or you're writing, it's you doing the writing, whereas a producer is more organisational. And I guess I'd begun to think that I was enjoying radio and was veering in that direction. I hadn't really had any appetite or thought about TV at that stage. It was a much more expensive, much more ambitious project that you didn't just get involved in on your own, especially when camera equipment was much more expensive and so on in those days. So I was getting involved in radio and I was enjoying it, and I was enjoying just presenting my own work and being involved in the kind of specifically creative kind of front end of journalism. So yeah, I guess.
And very soon you moved down to Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia, and became one of the BBC's, I guess one of the first correspondents the BBC had there as a full-time reporter.
Well, these words, I was told it wasn't even a string, the job I got in Tbilisi, it was an opportunity, which meant that the BBC would provide nothing up front, no flak jacket, no generator, no promise of any income, because often if you're a freelancer for an organisation, you'll have a minimum guarantee. They'll say, right, we'll take 5 pieces from you a month, or we'll assure you that financially you're not going to starve. Whereas this was really a tryout experience. The BBC was basically saying, well, we know you've done radio now on Pacifica, or on Monitor Radio, on IRN, on Deutsche Welle, on all these international, pretty low-key outlets. So we'll give you a chance. And you can set yourself up in Tbilisi at your own expense. You have to hire a flat and a car and try and find a fixer or a driver. And initially I was worried because I made this big financial outlay in Tbilisi, and all the wars were ending. Karabakh, Abkhazia, Ossetia, all these tiny little wars that were really the bread and butter in those days. You know, this was the collapsing Soviet Union, and it was around the periphery that were all these little nationalist conflicts breaking out. And I was thinking, geez, maybe this was a bad mistake. Maybe I should have taken your offer. But then Chechnya, the first Chechen war started in 1994, and I spent 2 years basically living there and covering probably still the worst war I've ever covered in terms of a superpower army smashing to bits a tiny little rebel force that ended up pretty much beating them the first time. And so that was a complete in-at-the-deep-end experience. And very quickly the BBC decided they could trust me, started using me more and more. I never needed any of those guarantees, because actually for the first 6 months in the job I probably made £100 a week and was really worried. And then there came a time when I was earning thousands of pounds a week, because I was on every radio outlet, and you get paid £40 per two-way. So suddenly it was financially viable, and I was getting the profile that you get from being in the right place at the right time, which is really all a stringer is and can hope to be, is to be in the right place and to make hay while the sun shines. And so I did that for 2 years, and on the strength of that, I applied for the Moscow job with the BBC World Service, which was a proper job with a salary. And I remember they offered it to me, and it was, I was thinking, no, I'm a freelancer, that's my gig, I like this kind of, I'm in control of my own thing, I've been doing it for about 6 years. And then I thought, no, let me go in with the BBC.
To go back to a brief memory, I remember being in Chechnya with you. We were trying to cross a river, I don't know if you remember, in an old, your Lada, wasn't it?
My Lada Neva.
And the river was rising and rising and rising, and we were just trying to get across this river before it went too high and would flood the engine. But I also remember you lost a crucial bit of your journalist's artifact on one of those trips. Do you remember that?
A notepad.
Yeah, a notepad, yes. Tell us about that.
Well, the river was more exciting, to be honest. Jeez, that was stressful. Halfway across the river and thinking we weren't going to make it. So we're going to have to abandon my precious Neva. No, that was it. Really, in the days, and it was a good experience of writing at speed under pressure, just with a notepad, because you didn't want to run out of your notepads, because this was it. You didn't have a laptop really. You needed the space to write and to think, but you had to think out your 1 minute piece or your 40-second piece as you were writing it, and it was a good discipline, I found. But I also used the back page to write down all my, who I'd done what for with the BBC, because you had to charge them at the end of the month, and if you lost this piece of paper, then you'd be at the mercy of the BBC's studio managers and whether or not they admitted that you'd filed for them. So yeah, that was quite a stressful moment when I lost my notepad.
Is going abroad and trying to set up as a foreign reporter the way to do it? Or is going in the newsrooms or the newspapers in Britain and trying to work your way through the system to get to that role? What do you think in retrospect?
It's tricky because it has changed. I mean, access to cheap cameras, access to cheap recording equipment, access to the internet to feed stuff, all the things that were a real proper barrier between the amateur and the professional are gone. So there is simply a lot more material out there for free that anyone can get, and so there's a lot less appetite from British newspapers or British radios to pay for stuff. But I'm struck by people who come to the BBC office in Johannesburg, and we have a program with the University of Johannesburg. People come in and do work experience, and the people who've really got something, a spark, are the ones who don't sit behind the desk. And I'm always having to tell them, journalism is not on the computer. It's not what you check on the internet. Just get out there, go and find original material, and sell it. Give it to the BBC. And actually, the ones who've really made it are the ones who've gone, I've just come back from a ballet in Soweto. It's amazing. I'm putting this piece together, and they'd give it to me, and I'd go through the script and go, and they come back and go through the script again, and I go, okay, promising. And by the end, they've got something on the World Service radio, because the World Service is always hunting for material. And that's how, I think there's still an appetite for people who are ready to go and, without perhaps too many upfront promises, are ready to just go and take a punt. But, to be honest, I've moved 20 years away from the grass roots, so I don't know how easy it would be, but it's certainly...
Times have definitely changed. I think it's intriguing how do you cover a war? I mean, I don't even remember the kindergarten we lived in Hassavjord, which we basically, if you arrive in a foreign country and there's a conflict going on, you need to find somewhere to work. You need some of the basics in life, like electricity, water, food, safety. You cannot operate right in the middle of a war zone. How do you approach going to somewhere like Chechnya, especially at that stage of your career when you're quite young?
I remember I had my Neva, and I had two 20-gallon gasoline cans in the boot, and the thing stunk. I had my generator by then, little generator, and I had a sat phone, which the BBC finally lent me, big suitcase sat phone. And with that, I was pretty much self-sufficient and some money. And you mentioned this kindergarten in Dagestan, but Tiotia Natasha, Auntie Natasha, I stayed in for months with this little old lady in the centre of Grozny, and she became a very good friend, and she looked after us and she cooked us breakfast, and we'd pay her $50, I can't remember what, anyway. And I remember the BBC, somebody from the BBC calling me and going, can we fax the wires, in other words, the Reuters and the agency copy, to the reception at whatever hotel you're staying at? And I remember thinking, you have no idea. I am sleeping on the floor in next to a bombed out building with a woman who really should have fled with the other refugees, but she's earning good money from us. And we're scavenging with the rest of Grozny's bombed out population and waiting to see how long we can stay before we have to move out to the countryside and follow the rebels, as we normally did in that war. We sort of stayed on the rebel side. So it could be, and it still is often, and the fun trips, the more adventurous ones, are the trips where you just set off into the wilds and you plan as much as you can, but you're never quite sure whether, I went to cover the war in Mali and I ended up driving to Timbuktu across the desert, and we'd really not expected that. We were assuming we were going to get a helicopter in or something. So you always pack sort of expecting at least some bit of camping element. So you have a rucksack that can fit a small tent, a small sleeping bag, and
but how do you prepare mentally to go and work in a war zone? How do you, what goes through your mind when you're on the way to the airport or to whichever departure point?
Well, Chechnya, somebody wrote, another newspaper journalist, Anthony Lloyd, wrote a great piece that I always remembered about the 5 stages of fear for Chechnya, covering particularly the second war in Chechnya in '98 and onwards, when the first war we'd stayed with the rebels. They were great, they were sort of heroic, they were beating this superpower army and they liked us. By the second war it had become much more radical Islamist fighters who were chopping the heads off journalists, and the Russians were trying to bar us from getting into the area at all, so we'd have to smuggle ourselves in, and even then we couldn't really trust the people who were around us. We used to get held up at gunpoint. I remember being accused of being a spy, and some nasty experiences. So the moment you decide, this was Anthony Lloyd's thing, that night you decided you're going to Chechnya, it's hard to sleep. Then there's the moment when you're flying to the airport. Then there's the moment you're on the plane and it's too late to change your mind. Then there's the moment you land in Chechnya or in neighbouring Ingushetia, and you know that people have been kidnapped off the plane before. So it's until your friendly security Chechens have come down the plane and held you on the shoulder and gone, we're here, it's okay, and so on and so forth. So there are some wars and some stories that can be very stressful. And sometimes, not always, and not always for the right reasons or for the right wars, they send security, ex-military basically, guys who will watch your back. And sometimes that's great, and you feel enormously relieved to have an experienced ex-soldier keeping an eye on you. I think particularly in kidnap kind of areas, when you may not be looking out for the right things. But sometimes it's a real pain, because actually, I covered so many wars before I ever went on a hostile environment course or had a...
Tell us about hostile environment courses, what's that involve?
So that is running around the woods in Hampshire, getting shouted at, and with people pretending that you're in a war situation. And some of it can feel a bit silly, some of it, particularly the first aid. I remember the first aid course, when I first went on it, I felt so stupid that I'd got to the age of 30 or whatever and didn't know this stuff. I felt actually embarrassed for how dumb I'd been, just with a family even, let alone going into war zones, that I didn't know these basic first aid, life-saving things. And then you refresh them every 3 or 4 years now. So those, and actually more and more as they got better at these experiences. It used to be squaddies trying to make you feel like you were some stupid little ignorant idiot, so they could show off how much war experience they had. But then they realized pretty soon that they had a lot less war experience than we did. And now it's a much more a two-way process where you sit with colleagues and you basically just discuss the latest experiences you've had in the field. And there's so much more cyber crime and issues that weren't there, and different weaponries and different types of landscapes and threats and conflicts. So it's actually just a good time to spend a few days thinking about danger and how you minimise it.
And they put you through some very realistic experiences. You leave the rather nice country mansion that you're based in a armoured Land Rover and go trundling through the Hampshire countryside. And then there's a loud explosion and people emerge from the woods with blood spurting out of their arms and carrying dead babies, dead dolls, but and you really for a moment feel you're in the midst of a war zone, and you have to treat the injuries in front of you. You have to realistically go and treat the broken arm, or do triage, work out which one to treat first, which one to leave. Usually the one screaming the loudest is the one you leave to last, because if they're screaming, they're alive. And the ones that are very quiet are the ones you go to first. Of course, there's not just you, there's your family as well. I mean, Jenny and the three boys. How did they react to you going to places like Chechnya and to Somalia, places you've been to lately?
The boys are curious, but keep it at arm's length. And my wife, I think that the thing is, it is obviously stressful for a family when you've got at least one of you going to silly places all the time. And so the way we've handled it is that we never suggest that my wife has a veto or a say or a role in discussing what I'm up to. That's on me. And I think if she felt she had a role and could say, well, I'm not sure about this particular trip, then that would jinx it in her mind, it would jinx it in my mind, and it would treble the stress on all of us. So instead, occasionally she'll get a phone call from somebody going, oh my God, have you heard the news? Well, wherever I am, something's happening, or I'm caught up in something, and then, that we deal with. But I think the only conflict, in fact, it's not a conflict, the only one that's been really weird has been Ebola. And that was the one where suddenly, because I think to varying levels, that's how most foreign correspondents and people involved in these kind of lives deal with it.
Well, I think that's a good point to look at some of the work you've done over the last few years, actually. I've put together a little compilation of excerpts from some of the stories that you've done.
This is where it all started. The very first encounter between storm and land. Not much of a contest. Which makes this the first village to be erased, and Maria among the first mothers to lose a child. She'd come here the day before to visit her parents at the beach with her 2-year-old son, Jake.
That time we come here is so full of life. He's so naughty.
When the typhoon roared in, Jake's grandfather tried to save him.
My father been hit by the wood. Then my baby gone. He cannot hold already. Then the baby drowned.
1 week on, and the survivors here are still waiting for aid. This may have been the first place to get hit, but it seems to be amongst the very last to get any help. That's because this is an extremely remote corner of the Philippines, and the storm essentially cut it off from the outside world. French troops are beginning to push into the countryside. Reinforcements are coming too, but not fast enough to protect every Muslim community now under siege. As for the killers, well, we found these men close by, members of the Christian militia group known as the Anti-Balaka. They're high on drugs and delighted about the mayor's death, though they say it wasn't their work. It's good he died, he says. The mayor was a Muslim. We don't want any of them to remain in this country. Even if he was a good man, he was a Muslim. No surprise then that there are scenes like this. A crowd of Muslims scrambling for food at a military airport. An empty road, empty houses. We're driving into the new stronghold of the virus, and to one village at its heart. In Kigbal, a cluster of children on one side of the road. We soon discover why. On the other side, everyone is either dead or dying.
She said she's sick. She has the sickness of a turnover. Her head is turning, so she's got a fever, presumably.
That's
that
what
means.
she said.
Do you think it's Ebola?
It is.
We're having to be very careful where we walk. There were dead bodies all around here that were cleared up just recently, but still in the middle of this village we have Ebola victims, and there are two or three here, these women and their baby daughter, and another man just down the road, and they're all believed to have the virus. They're just being left here, presumably to die.
Stunning view, adventurous location, property needs some work. Welcome to Mogadishu, a ruined city in the grip of an unlikely housing boom.
This beachfront property is good for coffee shop or whatever. So you have
Idris Darwan has come back from Britain, looking to invest in Somalia. The estate agent urges speed. Prices are soaring.
This is the patio where your customers enjoy the beach.
Yes,
Okay.
That's more like
With
beautiful,
nice seating,
beautiful views. Yeah, I can see it.
absolutely.
After years of war, it's no longer the guns that are hammering here. A new but fragile stability is luring many exiles back home.
You think there's money to be made here?
I believe so. I believe there's a lot of money to be made here, but it takes a lot of guts to stay in this place.
And what do your family back in the UK think of you?
They probably be saying by now he must be gone crazy, but I'll prove them wrong once everything is set.
Ghana's fans, shouldering the hopes of Africa and praying their team makes history. Uruguay, beware.
I'll just conquer them. Yes. And I'll put them in my pot. Yes. And I'll make them like a fire. I'll conquer them.
There may only be a few thousand Ghanaian fans here, but it does seem as if the whole of Africa is supporting their team. There's a sense of continental unity that it would be hard to imagine in Europe or anywhere else. Andrew Harding, BBC News, Johannesburg.
What's the best way of working as a TV journalist? What kind of team do you like to work in? What do you want around you when you're working, making TV news?
You want nice people. I mean, that's the thing. You're in hard, difficult, stressful places. You're working normally at great speed and great pressure. So you want the people who are not prima donnas. You want people who muck in. You want the cameraman who will do the editing and then cook dinner and then act as producers and vice versa. So it is, I mean, it's a lovely team experience when you've got the right team, and it can be really quite miserable when you've got people who don't get it and don't think that their job or their whatever status allows them to do certain things. So above all, you need people to muck in, and you need to work with people who trust each other. I mean, it's an extension of that, but you need, there's nothing worse than coming back from a day's shooting with a cameraman who you know wasn't up to the job, and that the pictures that you saw in front of you aren't going to be there on screen. And I'm sure it's exactly the same for a cameraman when he's got these brilliant pictures, but the guy writing to them is failing to pull out the kind of nuance and the drama from a war zone. And you probably have all seen those pieces that somehow didn't quite capture something. Maybe it's hard to explain why, and that's one of the weird things about putting together TV packages that work, that it's often very hard to explain why something works and why something doesn't.
What do you think, though, are the fundamentals? How do you find the story? How do you go about putting a television news piece together for the 6 o'clock or 10 o'clock news on the BBC, for example? What elements do you think are crucial?
Well, the ideal thing, of course, is that you're there. It's your story. You're not borrowing other people's footage from agency cameramen, and often you will have to do that. But ideally, you want to tell your story of your day or your few days, and you want to find. And I mean, there are so many different types of stories, but you really want to find characters. I mean, it is very much still a character-driven medium of finding people who. And they don't always have to speak English. That's obviously can be a real help in I think, relating to the viewer. If somebody speaks English, it's much easier to be drawn in. But somebody who's prepared to give you the time and the honesty to tell what's going on in their lives and to allow you into their lives a bit, because TV in particular, and radio, they are led by individual stories. And if you're not telling somebody experiencing the tsunami or the war, then you're probably losing viewers, because the only reason you're out there to experience it as a reporter, you know, and maybe convey something in your piece to camera, you know, at some point during the piece, is to get those individual stories. Otherwise, you might as well be sitting back in London and getting the agency footage together, and you probably do just as good a job.
You also work in radio. What difference is there working between TV and radio?
Well, often these days, usually these days, you go out as a team expected to produce everything. You're supposed to be tweeting while you're there, you're supposed to be blogging as soon as you can, you're supposed to be doing radio and TV, and it depends on the deployment and depends on the stage of evolution that the BBC is going through, because it's often changing. Suddenly it'll go, no, we just want people to do TV. Sometimes you'll be deployed. I remember getting deployed to the Chilean mining rescue, that disaster of those people stuck underground. And that was wonderful, because all I had to do was prepare for the evening news. I did the 6 and the 10 o'clock news the night they were released, and I didn't have to get distracted by anything, and so I had this fantastic material, and I could really focus. And it's one of the pieces I'm most proud of in terms of just sort of capturing the emotion of it all and the drama. And you couldn't do that if you were also filing for the 1800, which was the opposite with Pistorius. I remember covering the Pistorius trial, which the BBC, it was kind of nice actually, because normally it's Sky News and competitors going, why have you got so many people here from the BBC, or why are they sending so many dozens? And you go, well actually, because we've got 20 times more output than you do. You've got one TV channel, and actually we've only got 10 times as many people, so we're actually all working twice as hard. With Oscar Pistorius, the BBC was a bit sniffy about it, you know, it's not really our story, and Sky had sent far more people, which meant that I've never worked so hard in my life actually. I was sitting there in court tweeting constantly, coming out at lunchtime to do the 1 o'clock news, World at 1, the 1300 radio dispatch, going back in, tweeting for another few hours, coming out and then doing PM. They'd want a 5-minute package, the 6 o'clock radio 4 news, 6 o'clock news, lives, 10, and doing this. And by the end of each week, I would be completely at the end of my tether, and I'd get to this moment at around 6 o'clock. And I still remember it. It'd be the end of each week. I'd suddenly think, I just can't do this anymore. I cannot physically write fast enough to satisfy everyone. And I could, but I just would lose the will to live.
We've all been there. You've seen a lot of suffering over the years in various parts of the world. How do you cope with seeing people who are obviously going through great trauma in their lives? Do you ever become blasé about it, or do you still have a...
I have an appointment which I'm not sure I can keep next. At the end of this month, I'm supposed to go to the graduation ceremony of a little girl who we first found in the mud in Aceh after the tsunami, and she lost her whole family. In fact, she found a sister, but everyone else had died. And we kept in touch with her for a few years and went back and did lots of reports about her. And we became very close, and she really... It was hard to gauge. I thought, you know, we were close, but then it became very difficult to follow up with her because there was no mobile phone network, she wasn't on internet, and we got separate. There were no more aid organisations that had been helping keep us in touch. And I finally tracked her down to go back for the 10-year anniversary 2 years back. And it was just the most wonderful moment, because she came running out, this grown-up 18-year-old now, came running out, gave me the big hug, and she said, you're still my father. And it felt awful in some ways, because I thought, clearly I was there at this girl's most traumatic moments in her life, and we really did look after her. And then we just fell apart. And so now we sort of trying to stay in touch. And that's happened with a lot of kids and adults, and I think that's been part of what's helped to kind of just stay in touch with people. And also on a kind of, and it may sound silly or whatever, but I guess it depends what you work for and whether you feel what you're doing is good, and if you work for an organisation that you respect. But I really do think that you know, when we go to war zones and we interview people or we go in the aftermath of tragedies, we're not bringing aid, we're not bringing food, we're not helping them, but that actually you'd be amazed how much people want to feel heard, how much people think no one is listening to us and we're all dying here and no one cares. And they know that maybe their village isn't going to catch the BBC or whatever, but it is a profound, to me, human right to have your story told, to be listened to. And so I take huge sort of pride and comfort in the feeling that we're not going there as vultures. We're not going there and building our careers, although obviously there's an element of truth to that, on wars and on suffering. So that helps, and I think it helps to be not a cynical person and not to be a glass half empty kind of person, because I think if you did that, it would weigh you down, because you are exposed to an awful lot of suffering.
I was going to go on to ask, do you think as a journalist we can make a difference?
Sometimes not a big difference. I'll have to think. This is one of those questions where I'll have to think, you know. I mean, I think on specific stories and with specific individuals you can. And I think, yes, you know, journalism has the power to change the way, I mean, and it's not necessarily one story or one individual or one broadcasting company, but if you see the way social media is transforming some elections, in the last election in Nigeria I covered, and it was the first when there was finally the Liberation Party got the hell out of the way and the opposition won, something South Africa, you know, we're all hoping they can go through that process of actually voting the ruling party out. And the social media, the idea that everyone's eyes were on the election and that it was being funneled through to journalists and at different levels and different media, it was being scrutinized. And I think that's had a huge impact in Africa. I mean, it still means elections get stolen, but much less now.
I want to move on to Africa, actually. I mean, I spent a lot of time in Africa and I love it there. Tell me about your relationship with that continent. What does Africa mean to you?
I don't know, my grandfather was an entomologist who studied beetles, and he ended up spending 30 years of his life out trekking across Tanganyika, as it was then, following termites. So I'd always had this interest there, and I was delighted to move there after Moscow and the cold and the public hostility that is the kind of de facto manner in Soviet Russia and in post-Soviet Russia. And Africa, on the one hand, I hate when people talk about Africa because I don't see it as a thing. I mean, we're always being told that Africa is rising, or Africa is the forgotten continent, or the something continent. And actually, as you get to know it, you'll realize quite how offensive that is in many ways, and how these are such different countries and cultures. And I mean, I've been writing this book about Somalia, and we think of Black Hawk Down. And if you watch Black Hawk Down, some of the Somali rebel warlords are played quite obviously by West Africans. And in an African context, that's like having a blonde Scandinavian playing a Hezbollah leader. I mean, it's just silly, and it's very obviously silly. So on the one hand, I'm kind of, over time, I've got warier and warier of people who go, I love Africa, let me tell you about how much I love the wildlife and so on, because it's a much more complex, sophisticated place, and how much less prone I am to generalizations about Africa rising. I mean, I've been asked by the BBC over the last few years, do stories about Africa rising. And actually that ship has kind of sailed now, and everyone's gone, all right, well, there was a big mineral resource boom. Some countries harnessed it, most didn't. There's some corrupt elites who got even more rich. There are some countries that have nudged their way up the GDP rankings, but a lot of it got wasted, and actually, in many places, things are slipping back. That's not really about me, and I don't know. I mean, Africa is still a great place as a journalist, because there aren't many journalists certainly doing what we do, and it's still somewhere you can go and be the first. You can have proper, impactful journalism that really, like Central African Republic reports that we did, nobody was going, absolutely no one was going where we were going. And again, back to that feeling of doing good. I mean, when you drive out 2 days into the bush to what looks like the most deserted countryside on earth until you realise that actually perhaps 5 million people are hiding in the undergrowth and the outside world doesn't know it. And then you wander into the undergrowth and you find those people and they tell you their stories, and then you somehow manage to get out despite all these very nasty militias, and you tell your story. Then that's where you think there are very few places on earth where you can get both that kind of satisfaction from work and that feeling that you're, as a journalist, you really are doing something useful and important.
You live now in Johannesburg, a city which has got a reputation as being one of the most dangerous cities on the planet, I guess, to live in. But it's a place that I love visiting and spending time there. How do you find living in Johannesburg now?
Well, we always take our foreign editors, and you must do this if you ever follow in this path. You basically terrify them. So you take them out for dinner downtown at the wrong time of day. You tell them to leave all their jewellery in the hotel, and they come back home going, Joburg, Andrew, he's tough on his family, very brave. And you make sure you don't show them your lovely house with a swimming pool and your, fantastic garden and this lovely life that you can have. And yeah, Joburg's one of these places with a reputation, but actually mostly unearned. There's a huge security industry now whose only purpose and raison d'etre is to terrify you. So they don't talk about burglaries, they talk about home invasions. And they tweet and text you every day going, another home invasion, when somebody has leant in through a kitchen window and stolen a toaster. And that you'll keep paying them X amount of money to be on 24-hour armed response. Which is not to say there aren't dangers, but the dangers are really in poor black townships, mostly when people are killing their neighbours, frankly. That's where the 80% of the gun fatalities are. So once you rule those out and a few other factors, it's not that much different if you are living a privileged life in the wealthier suburbs.
You mentioned the life in the townships. It's been 2 years since Nelson Mandela died, and 22 years since the end of apartheid. Where do you see South Africa going in the next few years? What's happening there at the moment?
It's in a bad place, actually. It's 20 years seems to be a sort of particular moment for a post-independence or post-apartheid country that everyone feels like, on one hand, it's been 20 years. We should have X, Y, and Z. Things should be much better than they are. On the other hand, they don't want to, understandably, let go of blaming the past, because apartheid still governs, it's still etched into the landscape, into everything in South Africa. So you've got, and particularly with South Africa, which has had very bad leadership, very bad economy for the last 7 years, you've just got this resentment building up and it doesn't know where to go, there's no leadership, racial tensions are being inflamed, students, as you may know, are protesting on campuses, and they're not really protesting because they want change, they're protesting because they want a fight. And so it's almost impossible for universities to negotiate with them because they're not really interested in negotiating with the universities, they're really protesting against the government. But because they haven't got to the point where they're prepared to vote for the opposition or they don't see a parliament working, they skip that step and they just go straight to rioting. So it's going to need some very good leadership, which is very lacking at the moment, to pull it out of its downward slope.
So you live in Johannesburg and you have decided in the last year or so to have a change in career briefly, to change direction for a while and move from television journalism, radio journalism to writing a book. Tell me about that decision. Why did you decide to write your book about Somalia?
Well, I wanted to take some time off because, as I've mentioned before, if you stay as a foreign correspondent, you suddenly discover you've got a family and teenage kids doing A-levels and O-levels, and my wife's got a much more interesting job than me, and she had, I was very lucky that she'd agreed to sort of follow me over these 25 years, but it's come to the point now where actually I'm following her, and so I needed to buy myself some time, a couple of years off. The BBC likes to move people every 4 years. I've managed to get 6.5, but I'm still in the process of trying to sort of buy time. And actually, it's quite a stressful job, so it was good to take a break, just for sanity. And I did, if you write so often and so much, the idea of writing a book, it's just one of those things you want to do, I wanted to do. And I had felt that I'd got this pretty unique access to Somalia, because Somalia for 25 years has been a war zone, and for 15 of those years I'd been going in and had the BBC paying for 20 or 30 armed guards to get me in and keep me safe. So I'd got this breadth of experience there that very few others had, and I wanted to put that to some use. And I was going to write this sort of journalistic-y book about my experiences, and then I met this guy who happened to be the mayor of Mogadishu at the time, and just realised that I didn't want to write about myself, I didn't want to write about my experiences, I just wanted to tell this guy's story, because as a reader I like that life story kind of epic kind of thing in a book, and he just had this extraordinary life. And as I started researching, and I just kind of realised this is the book I want to write.
And how have you found the experience of writing a book different to working as a journalist?
Well, everyone I was quite intimidated, and have been for some time, about the idea of writing a book. You know, you get down to the 140 characters and think, you know, this is what I do haikus and the occasional poem, but the idea of 80,000 words is too intimidating. And then I sat down and realised that actually I've probably been writing 1,000 words a day for 25 years most days, you know, and busy. And so it was fine. It came pretty quickly. I wrote it in about 3 or 4 months. And it was great. And it was lovely to be able to wallow in something, because, I mean, that's one of the limitations of TV news in particular, that it's a very short, concentrated, you know, few hundred words, you know, 200 words probably for a 3-minute piece. So it's fleeting. Whereas to change tack and change speed was great.
Once you've got that book written, what's the next stage? How do you get that book sold out there?
It's bloody hard. I assumed blithely that, you know, I go on telly occasionally. I'm writing about a guy who's lived in London for 20 years. Somalia is one of the biggest recipients of British aid. There's a history, there's pirates, but the publishing industry, like journalism, is changing, and it's much more led by marketers. So the marketing departments all just looked up the last 10 non-fiction African books and went, nah. So it was very hard. In fact, I got an American publisher before I got a UK publisher. And you don't have to go through publishers. I mean, that's the other thing. I mean, there are many other ways to get your books published. Through Amazon, through Kindle, and self-published, and so on. So there are plenty more ways. I kind of just wanted to try and see if I could do it the old-fashioned way, partly so I could come and try and experience what it was like to give talks about books, and to do something a bit different.
And how has the Somali community reacted to your book?
Pretty well. I mean, they're very wary. It was a very clannish society, and they're like, who's this foreigner? Some of them know me from the BBC, but who is this foreigner? Why has he chosen this guy? This guy's from a different clan, and we think he's corrupt, and what is he saying about our country? And they only tend to get bad news about them. The only books are really ever about famine and pirates and so on. So this book actually is very different, because much of it is about the glory years of the 70s and 80s, and the open air theatres and the cappuccinos and the love story of this guy who grew up there.
I've got a few more questions to ask, but I thought I'd throw it out to you guys now to see if you've got any questions for it.
Andrew, you did mention very briefly your CV, and you studied English literature, and then you actually, I don't know if you actually mentioned it, but you did do a journalism postgraduate at City University in London. Now that was some time back, and a lot of things have changed. But I was wondering what tips you would give, if you, knowing what you know now about covering the world, if you were to be seated here as an undergraduate, dreaming of maybe covering the world as a journalist, or indeed as a creative writer, or in some sort of communications capacity, what would you try to do now to succeed and indeed break into that very exciting world?
I have a limited vision, because I didn't go through local radio, I just went out there, and so that's my perspective. But I would say that if you are the sort of person who feels like they're willing to just pick pick up and go and take a risk, then you're more likely to make it. Because, for instance, with the BBC these days, they have staff people in London, and they advertise these amazing jobs, like be the stringer or the reporter in Indonesia, and they'll be, bosses will be just thinking, why is no one applying for these jobs? Why are people not just, and people go, well, I've got a house, I've got something. So what I would say is get out early when you're not too tied down, if that's what you want to do. And don't expect anybody to do anything for you, but also don't be afraid, really don't be afraid to knock on doors, because I was very intimidated. I remember working at NBC Radio, and I mean, it's stressful to put yourself forward, to put yourself on air, to put yourself in a position where you're going up to important established figures and asking for a job or for something. But you've got to do it, and as soon as you're on the flip side and you start seeing people coming up to you, you realise that there's nothing to be scared of, that actually all they're looking for, the only qualification as a journalist you need is nous, is pushiness. And if you don't have it naturally, which I didn't, you learn to fake it. And I mean, the weird thing is it's almost like a sense of entitlement that you have to create or fake, because often now it's like with Mugabe or one of these leaders who go past, you've got to, as a journalist, be the one who goes, you've got to talk to me, and you've got to shout out. And that's really an extension of the whole experience of journalism. It's like you've got to feel like you have a role in this world, that you can be the one who stands up and goes, I want that job, I can do that, or I can ask this dictator or this president or this scumbag or whatever, I'm going to just put myself out there, even though it's kind of embarrassing, everyone's going to be looking at me, the guy's bodyguards could punch me up, or I could just look an idiot. But actually, that's the only way you'll get anywhere in journalism, I think.
I'm interested in the light of you saying you need to go and find the story by talking to people. In the light of that, what's the role of social media in identifying and kind of horizon scanning upcoming stories? I'm thinking particularly about Zimbabwe's This Flag movement, and what are the risks in trusting that?
Very useful. I mean, Twitter in particular is incredibly useful, particularly on, for instance, you're going to Westgate Mall after the bomb attack, and you can find stories that are rippling across, because it's a big, busy city environment where the stories are just vanishing off into if there's a mudslide, it's a village. That's where you've got to be. All the stories are going to come to one place. But if you're in a different sort of geography of the story, then social media can be incredibly important. And also in flagging them up, as you say, like in Central African Republic, we were hearing about these people out in the middle of nowhere, and it's one of the sources that you use. You don't put it on air at all, you don't trust it, but you use it as sort of as a way of spotters, in the way that journalists used to be the forward spotters for aid organisations, if you like, during crises. We'd be doing our reports and the aid agencies were going, geez, well, we need to get there. Now social media is kind of the frontline spotter in some ways.
Quite often the Western media is accused of negatively portraying and representing Africa. And the Ebola case is a case in point. Remember John Sutton, CNN columnist, arguing that we're asking the question, where is the empathy for the African Ebola victims from the Western media? So my question is, what's your thought, as a Western journalist, British journalist going into Africa and representing?
I generally, I certainly take no credit or blame for the way some American networks do, and that was particularly, I think there was a whole CBS 60 Minutes from Freetown, and there was not one African interviewed in the whole piece. But I don't accept that has anything to do with our reporting or the way we cover Africa at all. So I push back on that. I don't feel I have to apologise on behalf of Western media, because I think Western media doesn't exist as an entity. I think, there are lots of interesting questions being asked these days about the extent to which outsiders should be reporting on certain countries, and why do we want, And it's a sort of throwback to the kind of era when the BBC would send somebody out and they'd do their report and come back, and there would be no interplay between the country they'd reported on and the reporter. Now it's much harder actually as a journalist. Everything you see, you know is going to be broadcast in the country you're reporting on, unless it's North Korea. So you are much more aware of your responsibilities and the nuance and the way you're going to be judged, which is brilliant. I don't really go down the bad news line either, because I think journalism is not, our duty is not entertainment or spinning or clapping our hands and getting excited about Africa Rising. I think our job is to interrogate and to be sceptical. And I'm damn glad we were sceptical about large part. I mean, for instance, one of the last trips I did, and the one time I got really mad with the BBC, was going to Burundi for the coup. And I don't know if you know, a tiny little country in the middle of Africa, there was a coup, president trying to cling on to power, coup collapsed. A lot of the African reporters within the BBC were middle-class Africans from Bujumbura who disliked the idea of me and people like me suggesting that this coup was a dangerous thing for their country, that it could push this country that's only 5 or so years out of a civil war back down the road to a civil war, or that there was an ethnic thing to it, because everyone was claiming there was no ethnic element to it. And of course, in the Great Lakes region, genocide and so on, you've got to be very wary about blaming ethnicity. But when you go as an outsider like me and you talk to people in villages, they're only caring about not the coup, they're caring about whether there's a return to civil war and the ethnicity of the militia who's going to come along that night. So I think sometimes there is a danger of people caught up in their own countries of missing the larger picture. And I think that's why external reporters, and I don't mean white or European or Oxbridge or whatever, I mean external people, people from outside, whatever culture. I think there's a huge advantage in our understanding each other as human beings and in reporting on each other, on being an outsider and on seeing things clearly with that outsider perspective. And I think, yeah, there's plenty of bad news still to go around. And I mean, the other flip side to that is, you know, when I have done good news or quirky stories and tried to get them on the 10 o'clock news, the reality is it's bloody hard, because the editor of the day will be sitting there with 3 or 4 domestic stories, the football, the weather, Syria, and the American elections, and maybe he's got room for a light-hearted piece, but the "and finally" thing doesn't really play these days. So he's looking for something that fights its way on, that absolutely needs to be on, and millions dying in the Central African Republic requires it, whereas a moderately successful election in Mozambique can be pushed aside. Sorry, there was somebody up there.
To what extent, once you've started on a story, is the theme and the tone of it set by your editors back home, who are going to...
Very little, and sometimes kind of almost scarily little. You know, particularly when you're filing, as we normally do, under tight deadlines. There's no chance for people to review your material, and that's why increasingly, well, that's why there's a progression, a hierarchy in TV news, that they only send people into war zones and, you know, big stories, people who they've got 10 years or 15 years of trust with. So they know that if they put that tape or whatever, press that button, and your story goes straight to air with no one having looked at it, you're not going to embarrass the BBC, or, you know, it's not going to be a howler. I've had very little, as I say, sometimes worryingly little control or feedback or criticism. I remember once my foreign editor I think he had drinks with the head of the British Army during the Libya conflict, and he decided that the rebels were never going to win this war, and that we were being much too optimistic about this ragtag army. And my piece, he felt, was the piece on the 6 was much too optimistic. And we'd argued, and I said, there's air power. Air power means this ragtag army will win. And so we argued and tussled, and I may have changed a word or two and felt irritated for a while afterwards. But actually, most of that intervention comes when you're learning.
Do you think the opportunities exist for this group of people who are starting out today with all the huge changes in journalism? Why would you recommend it to them as a career?
I don't know. I mean, it's funny, it's 20 years on. The world has changed, and I remember asking a group of students last year in Oxford, who here watches the 10 o'clock news? And no one did. And that's been my life. My career has been building up to getting better and longer pieces on the 10 o'clock news. And, you know, the world's changing. So in some ways, I can't offer too much advice in that sense, because it is changing so fast. And I'm sure, what I would say is, I mean, it's very unpredictable. You know, where does it go next? I don't think you can necessarily tell just from where things are now. Clearly it's sort of broken apart in many ways, and there are more opportunities, full stop, but fewer opportunities to get proper careers in terms of, you know, photography used to be a good career, war photography. Now anybody with a camera can take a picture, put it up for next to nothing. So the number of newspapers and magazines taking those pieces and committing is fewer. But then again, I'm sure it'll take another zigzag and there will be opportunities.
Freddie, you.
I was just going to say, has social media hindered you or has affected you in a bad way or a positive way throughout your career? Or has citizen journalism been something you don't want to, you don't want citizen journalism to kind of take your jobs in other words?
Yeah, I don't want to, and I mean we're very, you know, there is I still believe, you know, there is a role for proper professional journalism, and America is the ultimate example of that. You know, America's media has failed the country, and that's why I sort of believe so strongly in the BBC still. The idea that there is I think it was Alan Little, wasn't he, talking about a courtyard where everyone passes through, and that's the BBC. Everyone passes through and they argue and they discuss, but they all agree that the courtyard exists. They all exchange ideas. They all understand that they're talking about the same politicians. And I know you've had Brexit and, you know, all sorts of criticisms justifiable of the way that was covered perhaps. But in America, you've got to the point where no one believes anything anymore. And how do you get back from that position? And that's incredibly, and I do think that a sort of viable, publicly funded or some sort of system where people respect journalism and have trust in it is essential for a functioning society. And the worry is that we're heading away from that.
You've got time for one more question if anybody's got any.
It's up the back.
You've been to some quite sensitive places. Has that ever made you feel like restricted or limited what you can say and report on while you've been there?
I've been to quite a few places undercover. So, I mean, the experience of being in Burma or in Zimbabwe while you're actually on the ground, very worrying. You know, I'm worrying about who you engage with and who might be seen with you, because, you know, if it's found out subsequently, you know, that you were who you turned out to be and you weren't a teacher or you weren't, you know, that you're going to get those people locked up. And I had a very bad night once in Singapore. I just got back from Burma, and the two people, quite good friends of mine, who I'd spoken to, and I'd been saying to them, and I put them on air, and I was saying to them, you know, one was a comedian activist, the other was an MP, or ex-MP activist, and I kept saying, are you sure you want to do this interview? And they were determined, it's incredibly courageous, and they got arrested, and one of them spent 6 years in jail for doing that interview, and it's a really, you know, I mean, it's an awful thing. Was it just because of that interview? I don't know. We never quite got to the bottom of it. Was that the pretext? Part of it. So those are really tough tough things to do you censor somebody? Because they want to talk, but you don't want to take the responsibility for what might happen to them? That's one sort of thought from there. Zimbabwe was almost comic because we were being followed constantly by these undercover police who were very bad at their jobs.
Right. Well, you guys, both of you, I have to say, Kevin and Andrew, very good at your jobs, obviously. But seriously, Andrew, thanks for the talk. Thanks for the wonderful work you're doing in all different parts of the world. And most importantly, thanks for coming here to Falmouth today to be with us.